Hello and welcome to the latest in Exchange Chambers podcast series. My name's David McCormick. I'm here with Sonia Masson. We're both barristers here at Exchange Chambers across Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds. Today we're going to talk about e-scooters, something many listeners will be familiar with and will see out and about on our roads, but particularly what we see as a bit of a takeover on our roads of e-scooters, what liability might look like for accidents caused by or involving e-scooters, and what the future might look like. I'm going to start by just talking generally about that takeover and just how frequent it is that e-scooters are being seen out and about on the roads. And you're on the way in this morning. In fact, I saw two or three just on a 2 mile drive into town, but not only on the roads, but in my view, driving quite erratically. One of them skipping the lights, not really paying very much attention to other road users, and it instantly had my mind flowing about today's talk and just how dangerous e-scooters are. I then also had a dive into the internet and Google to just have a little bit of a look around to see how frequent there are news reports now on e-scooters. And I'll just give you a few examples. 7th of March this year, GB News reported that a mother of 14 children died after falling off her own private electric scooter. Her family, the report was saying, were fundraising. She was only 47, suffered a fatal injury. As I say, that scooter was private, and she suffered a catastrophic head injury. A few months later, 28th of May, there's a story from Nottinghamshire police that again, a relatively young person, 40-year-old male, was on his way tragically to pick his son up from school, lost control of an e-scooter which he was riding. He wasn't wearing a helmet, fell to the floor, and again suffered a fatal head injury. He was actually riding along the pavement, which we'll come back to some of the rules and regulations about e-scooters later on in this podcast. And as I say, he was on his way to school. No third-party involvement in that collision. Tragically, he just fell off. Then, in between those two dates, in April, there's a story in the Northamptonshire Telegraph that there is a pedestrian who was angry after a Voi e-scooter, Voi being a company who rent out e-scooters and are seen, I think they're the red scooters you see out and about. This pedestrian had been hit by an e-scooter rider who was riding on the pavement outside her house, and actually within that story, you see the footage of it happening, and it really is as simple as her walking out of her house and the e-scooter rider just cutting across her path on the pavement. And then finally of the examples I'm going to give, because on the internet it simply goes on and on and on, recent news stories, is a story in the Irish Mirror from the 27th of June this year, which again, tragically, a second teen had lost their fight for their life after an electric scooter that he was travelling on was struck by a bus in the early hours in the morning. As I say, tragically, that was the second fatality arising out of that accident. The first rider having been unfortunately pronounced dead at the scene, the second going to hospital with serious injuries and regrettably later dying. So that's just a snapshot of what's going on and what the news is telling us. And I turn at this stage to you, Sonia, to say, why am I finding so many of these stories? Why are e-scooters all of a sudden so prominent? Just how many of them are there?
Well, there's no denying that e-scooters are popular, and that's because there are an estimated over 750,000 privately owned e-scooters in the UK alone. And although it's illegal to ride a private e-scooter in the UK, they are widely available for sale. And we'll come back to this in a moment. And if you are caught riding a privately owned e-scooter, you may be liable for criminal liability. And we'll touch on what those consequences may be later in this podcast. We also have the government trials, which are running in 31 different regions across the UK. That's probably why we're seeing so many e-scooters in big cities. And these are, of course, legal to use on public roads, of course, not on motorways. And since that scheme has started, it's estimated there have been about 15 million rides made to date. These scooters started with 37 trial e-scooters in July 2020. And now we're seeing over 20,000 trial e-scooters scattered all over different cities in the UK. These trials were due to end originally in 2021. The e-scooter takeover, I guess, began largely in lockdown, and the idea was to reduce reliance on cars, or during the pandemic on public transport. And over the past few years, we've seen extensions to the trials, which are now due to end in 2026. So it's likely that those number of rides are due to increase over the next few years.
I think, Sonia, what I would say about that is that the idea behind e-scooters, the benefit to the environment, etc., undoubtedly is a sound idea. I think the issue that probably the government, etc., are running into that maybe wasn't foreseen is twofold. The first is, and as you've just said, there's a distinction between the legality of riding a private e-scooter or a rental e-scooter. But to the naked eye, to the police, would you know any different?
No, definitely not. It's difficult to know unless you see that branding on the side of the handles. But even then, if someone's driving along the road, it's going to be different to differentiate between those that are rented.
And then the second potentially unforeseen issue is that, and I looked to again a recent article from the BBC, 2000 November 23. BBC said that more than half of casualties from e-scooter accidents are found outside the zones where you're legally allowed to use them, i.e., the trials have been set in very specific areas, and that's geographic areas. For example, they're in Essex, they're in Liverpool, etc. But also within those areas, there are essentially no-go zones, places where you shouldn't be allowed to ride an e-scooter. But my own understanding is that they still go, they slow down, but they still go, and that could still cause an accident, couldn't it?
Yeah.
And then also, I thought when you pull all of that together, the road safety charity IAM Road Smart said in light of the most recent figures about usage and accidents, we'll come back to accidents in a moment, they described the figures as, quote, shocking, and said that there was a, quote, Wild West culture on the UK streets, and they have urged the government to speed up legislation governing private e-scooters. But from your research and what you've seen, I take it the answer is it doesn't look like there's any speed at all when it comes to governing private e-scooters. It's just radio silence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the rules, regulations, and insurance rules surrounding e-scooters. It's important to point out at the start that an e-scooter does fulfill the definition of a motor vehicle under the Road Traffic Act 1988, and therefore all of the normal rules of insurance, technical standards, vehicle tax, licensing, etc. apply. But they don't apply to private e-scooters because the starting point is that they are illegal. So whilst other road users have the protection of knowing that anybody on a rental e-scooter will, within the terms of that rental, be covered by insurance, the vehicle will be subject to testing, etc. Other road users cannot have that protection when it comes to an illegal e-scooter unless the rider's gone above and beyond, but of course you couldn't get one insured anyway. So in terms of usage of an e-scooter, it's compulsory that a rider holds a provisional or full driving license. And in fact, Sonia, I don't know how many of these things you've used, but when I've used them, I remember that you have to scan, don't you, your license as a start of the process of using one. The difficulty with that, though, and you see this out and about when you see people who clearly are too young, is that there is a way, of course, to use somebody else's license.
Yeah. And no way of checking.
Yeah. Also, you've got to be following the highway code like other road users. You have to not ride on pavement. It's actually illegal to do so. But again, Sonia, I don't know what your thoughts are. I haven't seen these out and about, but I think you see them as much on the pavement as you do on the road.
if not more.
And then I think for myself, my own commuting to work, if I were to go on an e-scooter or a bike, the most obvious place would be along the promenade along the River Mersey. You see scooters on there all the time.
Yeah.
I think the theory is that private users would be the only ones capable of going their full speed on there, but I don't think in practice that's right at all. I think you see the rental scooters going full pelt along pedestrian zones like that, which not only is illegal, but of course very dangerous. It's compulsory you only ride within trial zones, or if not on private land. Again, out and about, I don't think we see that at all. Another huge issue is that they're only supposed to have one person at a time. And again, Sonia, I don't know what you see out and about, but I quite often see two people on e-scooters, which number one obviously is dangerous for them, but also in terms of controlling the e-scooter, they're not made to have two people on, which causes a significant issue. Also, like other road users, you're not supposed to use your mobile phone. But again, like other road users, I think of sort of modern cars, maybe not the most modern, but 5 or 10 years ago, they started a trend where you clipped your iPhone to your screen to use a sat nav. The rental e-scooters have exactly that same device available, and whilst we might like to think that people only use those mobile phone holders for sat nav or for the app that they're using for the e-scooter, the reality is, I imagine many people are also texting, listening to music, etc. I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, is that you should not be, and in fact it's illegal to ride an e-scooter when you're over the legal limit in terms of alcohol. But again, this is a massive issue in the city centres around the country, because what you end up with is sometimes young people under the influence of alcohol. I'm thinking ahead tomorrow to England playing. Everybody's out and about. There are no taxis.
Yeah.
And then there's almost this invitation in front of you of an e-scooter that you know will cost you £3 and you can get home. And I'm looking out the window now at the rain and thinking, I can see many people getting on those e-scooters tomorrow. So that's a massive issue, which, although those are the rules, they're not being followed. And then also, many people query helmets with an e-scooter. They're not a legal requirement, like they're not on bikes. Of course, they're recommended. And of course, we all know from a couple of the news stories I've just been through the catastrophic consequences if you don't wear one. Or they're not compulsory.
And I guess the difficulty there is, well, no one's really walking around with a spare helmet on them, so it's the convenience of the e-scooters which makes them so popular.
Yeah. I was abroad, it's a good point you make. I was abroad last year in Budapest in Hungary, and there were, like many European cities, e-scooters everywhere. But what I noticed as a massive change to here was that many of the branded e-scooters had clipped to them helmet, which I think is such an easy thing for these companies to implement if the government made that compulsory.
Absolutely.
And for them to ensure that there's always one available. But you're right, is that nobody's walking around with a helmet who has just in the moment decided to use an e-scooter. It's maybe different if someone commutes. In terms of speed, they ought to be limited to 15.5 miles an hour, but that's not always the case, especially with the privately owned ones. And I'll just touch briefly, Sonia, on probably the driest part of this podcast, which is insurance. But I think it's important because what I imagine many people listening will be thinking, and many lay people would think as well, is what happens if an e-scooter causes me injury? Or if I use an e-scooter and I'm injured, where do I get my remedy from? And I'll deal with it very briefly as follows. If you're renting an e-scooter, i.e. you're legally using an e-scooter, then the provider of that e-scooter will be insured, and therefore, in the circumstances where you are injured, you would, in theory, depending on blame, of course, have a remedy via their insurance. If, therefore, the rider of an e-scooter causes you to be injured, i.e., let's say you're a pedestrian, then again, that pedestrian would have a remedy via the e-scooter company's insurance. There's also a very interesting question. I think this is half remedied now. You and I were chatting about this morning, is that when these e-scooters were first rolled out, I'm thinking about during COVID, they were literally all over the streets, weren't they? And I think a lot of people were tripping and falling over them, and therefore were looking at whether or not they would have a remedy by suing the companies because they're littered all over the streets. But I think, from my own take on it, that's been remedied now by these squares that you see all around the cities, where it's now compulsory to put it in the square.
Yeah.
Less convenient, but probably safer. Then, in terms of private e-scooters, well, I think listeners will anticipate much more tricky because it's illegal to be using one. Therefore, there is no, well, it's very unlikely that the rider would have any sort of insurance that you could find your remedy in if you had a significant injury. Of course, you're still entitled to sue them as an individual, but where you may find your damages, i.e. whether they've got any money, is different. There may well be criminal liability, which could, in theory, lead to a fine or some sort of compensation, but nevertheless, that is unlikely to provide you with a remedy if you have a significant injury as a pedestrian. I think what we would say is that one of the answers may well lie in their home insurance, and that would be somewhere to look. And maybe also the MIB might have a role to play. The problem, though, with e-scooters, and the reason we're talking about it is because a lot of the answers we don't really know yet because there's not too much law, is there?
Yeah, exactly.
But what you can maybe tell us about a little bit more, you've already told us about scooters in numbers in terms of how many there are knocking about. What about the number of injuries and potential claims arising out of these e-scooters?
Well, if we look into the figures, it's no surprise that we're seeing lots of accidents involving e-scooters. And of course, e-scooter drivers are more vulnerable on the road. They're not protected by that vehicle body that we see with cars. But the issue is that in terms of the data, only a small proportion of those injuries are actually being recorded. There have been a few research papers on this, and when comparing the official UK figures to actual hospital records, we're seeing that there's a big disparity there. With if we take figures from 2021, for example, looking into 20 emergency departments, which showed 243 casualties involving e-scooters, where only 21 of those incidents can be found in the official UK figures. But we do have some figures from 2023 and worth looking into just to put this into perspective a little bit. So in 2023, there were 1,273 collisions involving e-scooters. That's in comparison to 1,402 in 2022. So a slight decrease there, but not a massive one. Of all the collisions involving e-scooters, only 281 included one e-scooter, i.e. no other vehicles being involved. That was in comparison to 341 in 2022. Right, so we are seeing a small decline here in the figures, but still huge amounts of accidents happening. And again, there were 1,365 casualties in collisions involving e-scooters, compared to 1,492 in 2022.
So the figures are dropping so far, but also that's with your caveat at the start that there is quite a lot of research to support that these are being underreported.
Absolutely, and I think a reason for that is perhaps people just think, oh, well, there's no point reporting, but also if we looked at the figures of the amount of private e-scooters we have on the road, the likelihood is people don't want to admit to driving illegal e-scooters on the road, so when they're going to the hospital, they're not reporting the actual cause of the accident. Again, turning back to the 2023 figures, there are 6 killed in collisions involving e-scooters in 2023. That's compared to 12 in 2022. And figures from May 2024 show that there have been 37 deaths since 2019. So that's since we saw the e-scooter trials being introduced originally. Data also shows, which is interesting, that there are more male than female e-scooter user casualties, especially those at age 10 to 39, and trends show that collisions are more likely to occur during rush hour, which is probably no surprise. We're seeing people using scooters to commute to work, to commute back from work. So we see an upward trend starting at 6 a.m, peaking usually around 8 a.m, and 4 to 5 p.m, and then we see a dip at 10 a.m and 5 to 10 p.m.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And in 2023, around 611 e-scooter user casualties recorded were estimated to have occurred outside of trial areas. So that's something that they've just picked up on. It's likely that a large proportion of these accidents are coming from those that are driving the private e-scooters illegally on the roads.
Yeah, I suppose coming back to your other point as well, if you are aware that riding your private e-scooter is illegal, it's just so easy to go in A&E and say you fell off your bike.
Absolutely, yeah.
And nobody's going to ask any questions. So what about the consequences then? You've obviously told us the numbers. What are the most common injuries that we're seeing?
Well, if we're looking at the figures and the data that we've got so far, common injuries, of course, are things like cuts and lacerations, but we're also seeing worse injuries such as broken bones to the legs, ankles, arms, and hands, and largely traumatic head injuries because, as we've heard, helmets are not compulsory. And actually, looking into the research into this, like I said before, e-scooters became more and more popular during COVID because of the social distancing aspect of traveling on public transport. But that meant that there were not only an increase of users, but also an increase in accidents.
Right.
And we saw hospitals being flooded with patients who were injured because of they were driving an e-scooter. We're seeing traumatic injuries. So we're seeing ICU beds being filled up with these kind of patients, which actually led to the British Medical Association starting a petition to call for tighter regulations on e-scooters because it was putting such a big pressure on hospitals.
Yeah.
So that was a massive issue during COVID, especially. I'm not sure what the situation is in hospitals right now, but I can imagine we're still seeing lots of accidents. There were calls for laws to be tightened, for riders to, have proper identification and calls for helmets to be mandatory. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the future, whether there'll be any responses to those kind of petitions.
I think what we can say with confidence, though, from what we've seen 3-4 years after the doctors are telling the government that something needs to be done, with reports now still calling this the Wild West, I don't think very much has been done.
Unfortunately, no, I haven't heard anything more than what we've heard back then.
All right, so we've got the stats. We know about the rules and regulations. Let's talk a little bit then about how we think this is going to pan out from a legal point of view. Let's start with the legislation. What legislation, Sonia, would cover generally an e-scooter accident?
So we're looking at the Road Traffic Accident Act in 1988, which classes e-scooters as motor vehicles. We don't have a separate category for e-scooters, not at the moment anyway. So we're looking at the same rules that would apply to bicycles and motorcycles. We also obviously have the Highway Code, which unfortunately doesn't offer much assistance in terms of the hierarchy of where e-scooters sit, but likely to be akin to a cyclist.
Yeah.
Realistically, in my view, if we look at an e-scooter rider, they're likely to be in the same vulnerability category as a cyclist or an e-bike rider, although there may be some debate around speed and bigger wheels and things like that.
Yeah, okay. And then let's think a little bit then about your cause of action. If I decide to go on an e-scooter today, which I rent from a company, and I'm knocked off that e-scooter by a car, let's say that driver we think has been negligent, where's my remedy?
Well, in those circumstances, the normal rules of negligence would apply. And obviously, depending on whose fault it is, it will determine where the fault lies, but it would be the normal route of negligence.
Yeah, so if of course it's my fault, then I've got no remedy because the company wouldn't be paying me out for anything unless there was something wrong with the scooter, I suppose.
Exactly, yes. So if there's some kind of defect, then you may have a remedy there of suing the company. If it was your own fault, there of course may no remedy there for you.
Okay. What about, and you may say we'll come back to this, what about if I'm riding a private e-scooter illegally and I'm knocked off it?
Well, if you're riding a private e-scooter, as we said, it's illegal, so some criminal responsibility may come in there.
Yeah, okay. And then I've got that video that I watched this morning of a poor lady just walking out of the house and getting hit by an e-scooter. That in that scenario was a illegal private e-scooter on the pavement, but let's just think about an example where perhaps an e-scooter hit a pedestrian who's crossing the road. Again, let's work on the basis that it's a legal rented scooter. Cause of action?
Well, again, it's going to be a negligence claim, but you also have to think about how contributory negligence might play a role in that. If you're riding recklessly or have done something negligent, it may be that your responsibility comes into play there.
Yeah, okay. So even on a legal scooter, number one, I could drive recklessly and be criminally liable. If I hit a pedestrian, that pedestrian could sue me. But also, if I'm involved in an accident where I'm hit by a driver who we think has been negligent, there's going to be question marks about my own potential negligence in maybe not wearing a helmet, maybe the way I'm riding.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I think going forward, I think we would say then contributory negligence, like in motorbike and cyclist claims, it is going to be a feature as lawyers we're going to have to sit up and pay a lot of attention to. Okay, the elephant in the room is illegality. Again, anywhere you look online about e-scooters and negligence or claims will tell you that the illegality defence may well play a feature in such claims, otherwise known as ex turpi causa. So we're talking here, aren't we, about a scenario where I'm riding an e-scooter that's privately owned by me. Somebody negligently causes me injury. Let's just say a car pulls across me and knocks me off my scooter. There's little doubt that I'm going to establish that it's the driver's fault. But where the defendant pleads that owing to my illegality, I cannot bring a claim.
Yeah.
That's it in summary, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the long list of e-scooter cases we're going to go through in this podcast where this has been fleshed out, it's non-existent, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'll just briefly touch on a couple of comparator cases with regard to motorbikes. But I don't think we can say that these are definitely going to be the authority because e-scooters do have such a different status and such a different vehicle. Clark and Farling, 2018, maybe a good example. 15-year-old claimant was the passenger on a motorbike that was involved in an accident, and unfortunately the claimant suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. The defendant raised the illegality defence, saying that the claimant, I repeat 15, assisted or encouraged the driver of the motorbike to drive dangerously. And what the court found is that he was not a party to a criminal joint enterprise of dangerous driving and therefore rejected the defence. So it's a good place to start in terms of the principle of the defence, but I don't think it helps us too much in terms of the illegality of riding a private e-scooter. Later authority, probably going to pronounce this wrong, Pryaku Finch, 2021, again, motorcyclist. Motorcyclist overtook a defendant Land Rover who there was a collision with the van. Overtaking a vehicle and collided with the van coming from the opposite direction. Motorcyclist was found to be holding on to a small amount of cannabis in his possession. Toxicology evidence suggested he was under the influence when driving, or might be at least, and wasn't registered to drive the motorcycle, and was driving at 55 miles an hour. So multiple elements of illegality in this case. The experts in the case agreed that that claimant's headlights would have been visible to the defendant if he'd been driving slower, i.e. it was causative. The defendant accepted that he hadn't seen the claimant, and the claimant found that had the defendant looked, he would have seen him. but might not have appreciated the speed. So in that case, despite all of those potential hurdles of illegality, i.e. being over the limit, unregistered and speeding, at least I think speeding being 55 miles an hour, nevertheless was able to establish primary liability subject to 80% contributory negligence. But a good example and a good authority of just how high the bar is. Can I turn to you, Sonia, and ask you this question? Number one, do we think that illegality is going to be a feature in future e-scooter claims? And if so, is there any authority that helps us along the way in terms of whether it's going to be a realistic defence?
I definitely think it's going to be something the courts are going to have to grapple with. It'll definitely be a defence that many defendants will raise in any event, especially whilst we have no legislation on the use of private e-scooters, other than the fact that they're illegal. But there has been one case that has come through the courts in 2023 in the context of suing the local authority. That case is Drago and LB Barnett. And this was the first e-scooter case where we've seen the courts deal with the issue of the illegality defence. So the rider was illegally riding a private e-scooter when she hit a pothole and broke her knee. The claimant said she couldn't avoid the pothole because it was large and dangerous, and she fought a claim against the local authority on the basis that they failed to adequately maintain the road. And because the e-scooter was being driven illegally, the local authority claimed that she shouldn't have been on the road in the first place, and therefore the injuries were caused by her own unlawful act. The claimant was unable to properly identify the defect that caused her injury, and that's the reason that the claim was dismissed. And in that case, the court held that the fact that the claimant was riding her scooter illegally was not something that court needed to address. So in a nutshell, the court did swerve the question there, and we don't exactly have an answer of how the legality defence will play out. But it's a good indication of a defendant bringing that defence to the courts. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in future cases.
Yeah, I've got no doubt that it will. When you were going through the numbers earlier, with these private e-scooters in particular being so high in numbers, there is no doubt in my mind that the defendants in such cases are going to try and establish and create an authority that the illegality defence is in fact triggered, because these are just going to grow and grow in terms of claims. I was excited as you were going through the case of Drago there, thinking we're about to get an answer, but unfortunately the court didn't think it needed to address that question because the claim was dismissed for another reason. So in summary, I think, Sonia, where we are is there are tons of e-scooters out on the roads. These e-scooters are involved in a high amount of accidents on the figures provided, with the caveat that what's very clear is that many e-scooter accidents are not reported because they're either minor or once the victim, if you like, goes to hospital, they don't state that it was an e-scooter that they were riding. So they're prominent, the accidents are happening a lot, and us as personal injury lawyers should expect to, in the future, see a lot of claims coming across our desks. That there is a significant question about whether or not, when it comes to private e-scooters, the illegality defence will succeed in many of these claims. And the current situation is it's a bit of a wait and see.
It is, yes.
All right. Well, Sonia, thank you very much. Thank you very much to our listeners. I hope that's been enjoyable and helpful. This is very much a moving area of law, and it may well be that we revisit it when there's further case law. We welcome via Chambers feedback to this podcast and, in fact, the series of podcasts that we're doing. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.